Millionaire CEO abandoned his pregnant wife and disappeared. 20 years later, at an elite business summit, he's stunned when a young woman steps on stage, his secret daughter, now a rising business star poised to destroy everything he built. A high-tension scene at an elite gala where the legendary Carl M. Hayes is silenced by the arrival of a young woman, Alexa D. Garcia, who isn't just a guest, she's the majority shareholder of his newest rival. The story flashes back to the ultimate betrayal, Carl walking out on his wife with nothing but a divorce decree, leaving her to raise Alexa in a world that Carl promised she would never conquer. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know. This story goes as far as Canada, all of United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Let's begin. 20 years ago, Carl M. Hayes stood in the cramped studio apartment on the Lower East Side, his Italian leather luggage already positioned by the door like silent sentinels guarding his escape route. At 38, he'd finally received the call he'd been engineering his entire adult life. The board of Hayes International Holdings wanted him as their new CEO. The position came with an 8-figure salary, a corner office overlooking Central Park, and one non-negotiable condition: no distractions, no complications, no messy personal entanglements that might compromise his absolute dedication to the company. Maria Garcia sat on their second-hand couch, 7 months pregnant, her hands resting protectively on the swell of her belly. At 28, she still possessed the fierce intelligence and passionate optimism that had made Carl pursue her 3 years ago, when she was nothing more than a brilliant MBA student working double shifts at a hospital cafeteria to pay tuition. Back then, her determination had seemed charming, even admirable. Now, it was simply inconvenient. "I'm offering you $50,000. Carl said, his voice carrying the clinical detachment he used in hostile negotiations. "That should be more than enough to handle the situation quietly. Get the procedure, or don't. That's your choice. But either way, I won't be part of this." Maria's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks as she struggled to comprehend the man standing before her, this cold stranger wearing her husband's face. "Carl, please. This is our baby. Our family. We can make this work. I'll take care of everything. You won't have to change anything about your career. I just need you to—" "To what?" Carl interrupted, his patience evaporating. "To pretend I want this? To play house while the board questions my commitment? To sacrifice everything I've worked for because you were careless about birth control?" The cruelty of the accusation hung in the air between them. They both knew the pregnancy hadn't been carelessness. It had been hope, mutual desire, the natural consequence of two people who'd once believed they were building a future together. "I love you," Maria whispered, the words breaking on a sob. "We love you. Please don't do this." Carl picked up his luggage, the weight of his designer bags, nothing compared to the weight he was about to shed from his life. "If you choose to keep it, that's your burden. I'll have my attorney send papers. Don't contact me again. Don't show up at my office. Don't try to complicate my life with your choices." He walked to the door, each step decisive and final. Behind him, Maria's sobs grew louder, more desperate, her voice pleading with him to stay, to reconsider, to remember the man he'd been before ambition had consumed everything human inside him. Carl opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and closed it firmly behind him, sealing away the sound of her grief. He didn't look back, didn't hesitate, didn't allow himself to feel anything except the cold satisfaction of a problem efficiently solved. In the apartment, Maria Garcia sat alone in the suddenly silent space, her hands cradling her swollen belly, feeling the baby move inside her. She understood with devastating clarity that the man she'd loved was gone, and the child growing inside her would never know her father. The life she'd imagined, the family, the partnership, the future they'd planned together, had just died in the time it took for a door to close. She was alone now, completely, terrifyingly alone. The divergence happened slowly at first, then all at once, two lives splitting like a river around a stone, creating worlds so different they might as well have existed on separate planets. Carl M. Hayes became a titan. Within 5 years of abandoning his family, he'd transformed Hayes International Holdings from a mid-tier investment firm into a powerhouse, generating $300 million in annual revenue. By year 10, he was on the cover of Forbes, his silver-streaked hair and tailored suits photographed against Manhattan skylines that symbolized everything he'd sacrificed to achieve. His TED Talk, The Price of Excellence, Why Success Demands Ruthless Focus, went viral with 8 million views. He spoke about eliminating distractions, about the courage to make difficult choices, about refusing to let sentiment compromise strategic vision. The audience applauded. No one asked about the wife and child he'd erased from his carefully curated biography. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in a different America entirely, Maria Garcia worked the breakfast shift at Morrison's Diner from 5 a.m. to noon, the cleaning crew at office buildings from 1 to 9 p.m., and weekend retail at a discount clothing store. Baby Alexa spent her first years being passed between neighbors who charged what Maria could afford, which was almost nothing. Maria learned to function on 4 hours of sleep, learned to smile through the bone-deep exhaustion, learned to go without eating so the small amount of food in their refrigerator could go to her daughter instead. By the time Alexa was 8, Maria's hands trembled constantly from untreated nerve damage. By 12, Maria had developed diabetes she couldn't afford to manage properly. By 15, her heart was showing signs of strain that would have been preventable with rest, proper nutrition, basic medical care, all luxuries that existed in Carl's world, but not in theirs. Alexa grew up brilliant and angry, watching her mother destroy herself in slow motion while other kids complained about parents who bought them the wrong color iPhone. She earned straight A's, not through privilege, but through fury, studying by flashlight under blankets after her mother finally collapsed into exhausted sleep at midnight. She won every academic competition, earned every scholarship, absorbed knowledge like someone preparing for war. At 16, during a school research project on public records, Alexa typed her own birth certificate information into a database and found a name in the father field she'd never seen before. Carl Matthew Hayes. She Googled him and felt the world tilt sideways. There he was, Fortune magazine cover, March 2019, the man who built an empire on ruthless efficiency, net worth $800 million. Residence, $15 million Manhattan penthouse. Relationship status, perpetually single by choice. Alexa stared at the photograph of a distinguished man with silver hair and expensive suits, living in obscene luxury while her mother wore shoes with holes in them and rationed insulin she couldn't afford to replace. This man, her biological father, had money for private jets and vacation homes and tailored clothing that cost more than their annual rent. And her mother was literally dying from poverty he could have prevented with a single check he'd never miss. The rage that ignited in Alexa's chest that day never went out. 2 years later, when Maria collapsed at work from exhaustion and was rushed to the hospital, Alexa sat beside her mother's bed in the charity ward, holding her hand while machines beeped their warnings. Maria's face looked grey, decades older than her 48 years. The doctor had used words like chronic stress, organ damage, unsustainable. Alexa squeezed her mother's hand and made a vow in the antiseptic silence. She would become so successful, so powerful, so undeniably brilliant that Carl M. Hayes would be forced to see her. Forced to acknowledge that the daughter he'd discarded like garbage had become worth more than everything his blood money had built. And when that moment came, when he finally looked at her and realized what he'd thrown away, She would make sure he understood exactly what his choices had cost. Not just her, not just her mother, but him. He just didn't know it yet. Alexa Garcia arrived at Stanford University with a full academic scholarship, 2 suitcases of second-hand clothes, and a fury so carefully controlled it looked like ambition to everyone who met her. At 18, she was already different from her classmates, while they treated college like an extended networking party funded by their parents' portfolios. Alexa approached her double major in business and computer science, like someone decoding the blueprint to a building she intended to demolish. Her professors noticed immediately. During her first semester, Dr. Marianne Chen pulled her aside after a strategy seminar where Alexa had dissected a Fortune 500 merger with surgical precision. "You don't just understand theory," Dr. Chen said, genuinely unsettled. "You see patterns the rest of us miss. Where did you learn to think like this?" "Necessity," Alexa replied, and refused to elaborate. By sophomore year, she'd launched Garcia Strategic Solutions from her dorm room, a tech consulting firm that helped small businesses optimize their operations with strategies usually reserved for corporations that could afford McKinsey's 7-figure fees. She charged modest rates deliberately, building a reputation for brilliance combined with integrity, the kind of business ethic that generated fierce loyalty and powerful word of mouth. Revenue hit 200,000 her first year, 700,000 her second. But Garcia Strategic Solutions was only the visible part of Alexa's architecture. Late at night, while her roommate slept, Alexa studied a different curriculum entirely. Hayes International Holdings quarterly reports, SEC filings, corporate structure, board composition, subsidiary relationships, partnership agreements. She memorized the names of every executive Carl had fired, every competitor he'd crushed, every business deal that had required ethically questionable decisions disguised as strategic brilliance. She networked with deliberate precision, attending industry conferences where she'd accidentally encounter former Hayes International employees, people who'd left bitter, disillusioned, carrying stories about Carl's management style that never made it into his TED Talks about excellence. She collected information like others collected degrees, building a detailed map of her father's empire and, more importantly, its vulnerabilities. By 20, Garcia Strategic Solutions had generated $47 million in revenue. Business Insider called her the strategic prodigy disrupting corporate consulting. Forbes featured her in their 30 Under 30 issue with a photograph where she'd deliberately angled her face to obscure the features she'd inherited from Carl. She refused most interview requests, kept her personal life completely private, and cultivated an aura of mysterious brilliance that made her even more intriguing to the business press. What none of them knew. Through a complex network of shell companies and strategic partnerships, Alexa had been quietly acquiring shares in 3 of Hayes International's subsidiary companies. Small positions, carefully disguised, positioned like chess pieces, waiting for the end game nobody else could see coming. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, forwarded by her assistant with a note. "This feels significant. The Global Business Leadership Summit cordially invites Alexa D. Garcia to deliver the keynote address at this year's conference. As you may know, we will also be honoring Carl M. Hayes with our Lifetime Achievement Award during the same event. We believe having both established and emerging business leaders share the stage would create a powerful dialogue about the future of industry leadership." Alexa read the invitation 3 times, her heart rate steady despite the magnitude of what had just landed in her inbox. They wanted her to share a stage with her father, wanted her to speak at the very event designed to celebrate the man who'd abandoned her before she was born. She typed her response with hands that didn't shake. "I would be honored to accept." The pieces were moving into position. The daughter Carl Hayes had thrown away was about to step onto his stage, into his spotlight, and show him exactly what 20 years of his absence had created. He just didn't know he'd invited his own destruction to keynote his coronation. Carl M. Hayes stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, 43 stories above Manhattan, reviewing the agenda for the Global Business Leadership Summit with the detached interest of someone who'd attended hundreds of these events. The Lifetime Achievement Award was a formality, another trophy for a collection that had long ago stopped meaning anything beyond strategic positioning and favorable press coverage. The keynote speaker is confirmed, his assistant Sarah mentioned, placing the final event materials on his desk. That Garcia woman everyone's talking about, the young tech prodigy. Should be interesting to hear what someone her age thinks she can teach this crowd. Carl barely registered the comment, his attention already shifting to the quarterly projections spread across his second monitor. Garcia. Common enough surname. Probably some overconfident millennial who'd built a decent-sized startup and thought one successful exit made her qualified to lecture industry veterans. Then his head of competitive intelligence, Marcus Chen, appeared in his doorway with the expression he reserved for problems that required immediate attention. "Sir, we need to discuss Garcia's strategic solutions." Marcus placed a thick folder on Carl's desk. "We've been monitoring their movements for the past 6 months. They've been quietly acquiring positions in 3 of our subsidiary companies, Datacom Holdings, Riverside Financial Services, and TechCore Innovations. The individual stakes are small, but the pattern is concerning. This isn't random investment. This is strategic positioning." Carl's attention sharpened instantly. He opened the folder, scanning the detailed acquisition timeline. Who's behind this? Alexa D. Garcia, 20 years old, the same person keynoting your summit. Marcus pulled up a photograph on his tablet. "And sir, there's something else you should see. I ordered a comprehensive background check." The report filled 3 pages. Carl's eyes moved mechanically through the data. Age 20. Birth date, the 15th of April, 2005. Mother, Maria Elena Garcia. Father, unknown. Education, Stanford University, full scholarship. Revenue, 47 million last fiscal year. Notable achievements. Carl stopped breathing. The 15th of April, 2005. Exactly 9 months after he'd walked out of that cramped apartment. Exactly 9 months after he'd left Maria crying on their second-hand couch. "Pull up her photo," Carl said, his voice barely above a whisper. The image filled Marcus's tablet screen, a striking young woman with long brown hair and sharp features, standing on a conference stage in a crisp white blazer. Her eyes, dark brown, intelligent, penetrating, stared directly into the camera with an intensity that made Carl's hands go numb. She had his bone structure, his eyes, the same asymmetry in her smile that he saw in his own reflection every morning. "Sir?" Marcus's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Carl forced himself to speak normally, to breathe normally, to function, despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. Thousands of people share that surname. The timing is coincidental. She's just an ambitious entrepreneur who's made some smart investments in our sector. But even as he spoke, Carl knew he was lying to himself. The way she'd positioned herself in his business ecosystem wasn't coincidental. The timing of her acquisitions wasn't random, and that photograph, those eyes that mirrored his own, couldn't be explained away by statistical probability. "I'll attend the summit in person," Carl said, closing the folder with hands that wanted to tremble. "Clear my schedule for that week. I want front-row seating for the keynote presentation." Marcus looked surprised. "Sir, you'd planned to send James in your place. You said these events were—" "I've changed my mind." Carl's voice carried the finality that ended all discussion. "I need to see this Alexa D. Garcia face to face." After Marcus left, Carl stared at the photograph for a long time, trying to convince himself he was seeing patterns that didn't exist, connections that couldn't be real. But somewhere beneath 20 years of carefully constructed denial, he knew the truth with bone-deep certainty. His daughter was coming for him, and she'd been preparing for this confrontation her entire life. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria buzzed with the particular energy that accompanied gatherings of the extraordinarily wealthy and powerful. Carl M. Hayes moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands with CEOs and venture capitalists, accepting congratulations on his Lifetime Achievement Award with the humble pride that photographed well for the business press, documenting the event. 800 industry leaders filled the opulent Spaceboard members, investors, journalists, competitors pretending to be colleagues. Carl's world, perfectly curated and completely under his control. Then the lights dimmed for the keynote presentation, and Alexa D. Garcia walked onto the stage. Carl's breath caught. The photograph hadn't done her justice. In person, the resemblance was undeniable. His eyes, his bone structure, the confident bearing that came from genetic inheritance rather than learned behavior. She wore a crisp white blazer over black, her long brown hair falling past her shoulders, and when she began speaking, the entire auditorium leaned forward to listen. The future of business leadership isn't about maintaining existing power structures, Alexa said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the sound system. It's about recognizing that our industry has been built on narratives that erase the true cost of success the people destroyed, the families abandoned, the lives sacrificed, so that men in expensive suits could claim they achieved greatness through their own merit alone. The presentation was masterful. She dissected market disruption strategies with surgical precision, offered insights about emerging technologies that had several venture capitalists frantically taking notes, and commanded the stage with an authority that made her age irrelevant. Carl found himself grudgingly impressed, despite the dread coiling in his stomach. Then Alexa's tone shifted, her expression hardening into something cold and purposeful. Before I conclude, I want to acknowledge someone in this audience who taught me the most valuable lesson of my career. Her eyes found Carl in the front row with laser precision. Mr. Carl M. Hayes, would you please stand? Carl rose automatically, confused but accustomed to public recognition, expecting generic praise about his industry leadership. The applause was polite, anticipatory. 20 years ago, Alexa continued, her voice dropping to something sharp enough to cut. This man, my biological father, taught my mother and me that success in business requires ruthless elimination of anything inconvenient to your ambitions, including your 7 months pregnant wife and your unborn daughter. The auditorium went silent. Carl felt the blood drain from his face as 800 pairs of eyes swung toward him. You see, Alexa said, advancing her presentation to display a split image, a young woman holding a newborn baby beside Carl's corporate headshot from 20 years ago. Carl M. Hayes is the father who abandoned us before I was born, who offered my mother $50,000 to handle the situation quietly, who disappeared so completely that I grew up watching my mother destroy her health, working 3 jobs while he built his empire and gave TED talks about the courage to make difficult choices. Camera flashes exploded. Reporters surged forward. The room erupted in gasps and frantic whispers as journalists scrambled to capture the moment a titan's carefully constructed image imploded in real time. But Alexa wasn't finished. For the past 3 years, I've been quietly acquiring strategic positions in Hayes International Holdings subsidiary companies. I currently hold majority stakes in 3 key operations. I've secured voting agreements with board members, tired of autocratic leadership. And, as of yesterday, I purchased the company holding the mortgage on Hayes Tower, his crown jewel. Carl's legs almost gave out. The world tilted sideways as he realized the full scope of what his daughter had built. Mr. Hayes has a choice, Alexa said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent auditorium. Publicly acknowledge his abandonment establish a $50 million foundation supporting single mothers in business, step down as CEO, and issue a formal apology to my mother. Or I will systematically dismantle everything he's built using the same ruthless tactics he taught me to admire. She smiled, then cold, victorious, unmistakably his daughter. Either way, the girl he threw away like garbage has already won. Carl stumbled from the auditorium through a gauntlet of camera flashes and shouted questions, his Lifetime Achievement Award forgotten on the stage, his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him, destroyed by the daughter, whose existence he'd spent 20 years pretending didn't matter. She'd been right about one thing. He had taught her well. Empire. Carl's phone rang continuously with calls from board members, investors, journalists, and competitors, all of them circling like sharks who'd finally smelled blood in the water. The emergency board meeting lasted 6 hours. 12 directors, who'd once treated Carl like an infallible visionary, now stared at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to barely concealed satisfaction at his downfall. 3 major investors threatened to pull funding. 2 subsidiary CEOs submitted immediate resignations. The company's stock price dropped 14% in 72 hours. Carl retreated to his penthouse and watched his carefully constructed world disintegrate in real time through floor-to-ceiling windows that suddenly felt like a prison rather than a throne room overlooking his conquered kingdom. For 20 years, he'd convinced himself that walking away had been a difficult but necessary choice, the price of excellence, the sacrifice required for greatness. Now, forced to confront the actual human cost of his decision, broadcasted across every media platform, the rationalizations crumbled like paper in fire. The message arrived 3 days after the summit. Text only, no greeting. Meet me at Riverside Park, East Bench, near 116th Street. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Come alone. This is your only invitation. A. D. G. Carl arrived 15 minutes early, his hands shaking for the first time since his first board presentation decades ago. When Alexa appeared, she carried a leather portfolio and wore the same cold precision she displayed on stage. No tears, no screaming, just devastating, documented efficiency. She sat beside him without greeting and opened the portfolio. "This is what your choice cost," she said, spreading photographs and documents across the bench between them like evidence in a murder trial. My mother's medical records showing stress-induced diabetes at 42. Hospital bills she couldn't pay. Eviction notices from apartments we lost because she missed rent working 70-hour weeks. My elementary school records noting I came to class hungry 17 times in 3rd grade alone. Carl stared at the documents, each one a knife wound to whatever remained of his conscience. "I was young," he heard himself say, the excuse sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "I was ambitious. I was afraid that a family would derail everything I'd worked for. The board wanted millions of people manage careers and families." Alexa interrupted, her voice sharp as surgical steel. "Your complication was my entire existence. Your fear of inconvenience meant my mother developed heart problems at 45 from exhaustion. Your difficult choice meant I spent my childhood wondering what was wrong with me, that my own father would rather pretend I didn't exist than acknowledge my humanity." Each word landed with devastating precision, dismantling 20 years of self-justification. Carl tried again. "If I could go back." "You can't." Alexa closed the portfolio. "But you can choose what you do now. You can fight me using your remaining influence and wealth, potentially damage my company, and confirm every terrible thing I believe about you. Or you can accept accountability, face genuine consequences, and try to become someone capable of understanding that other people's lives matter as much as your ambitions." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the city Carl had once believed he'd conquered. He looked at his daughter, this brilliant, damaged young woman he'd created and abandoned, and felt something crack open inside his chest that had been sealed shut for 2 decades. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexa stood, gathering her portfolio with the same controlled efficiency that characterized everything about her. "I want you to acknowledge publicly what you did. I want the $50 million foundation for single mothers established and operational within 6 months. I want your resignation as CEO by the end of this quarter. And I want you to call my mother and apologize for 20 years of cruelty." She turned to leave, then paused. "I don't want your money for myself. I don't want a relationship. I don't even want your forgiveness, because you're not entitled to offer it. I want you to spend the rest of your life understanding that your actions had consequences for real human beings, and that wealth doesn't exempt you from basic human decency." Carl watched her walk away, his empire crumbling, his reputation destroyed, forced for the first time in 20 years to confront the monster his ambition had created. The daughter he'd thrown away had given him a choice: continue being that monster or try to become something better. He just wasn't sure which option terrified him more. Carl M. Hayes stood before 200 journalists in the same Waldorf Astoria ballroom where he'd received his Lifetime Achievement Award 6 weeks earlier. But this time, there was no applause, no congratulations, no carefully curated celebration of success, just camera flashes and the suffocating weight of accountability 20 years overdue. 20 years ago, Carl began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands gripping the podium. "I abandoned my pregnant wife and unborn daughter because I was offered a CEO position that came with conditions I was too ambitious and too cowardly to refuse. I told myself I was making a difficult choice required for success. The truth is, I made a cruel choice that destroyed lives while I built an empire on the wreckage of the family I discarded." He paused, forcing himself to continue. "Maria Garcia and my daughter Alexa suffered poverty, medical crises, and grinding hardship that I could have prevented with a fraction of my wealth. I spent 2 decades rationalizing my abandonment as necessary sacrifice. It was simply cruelty, disguised as strategy." In the audience, Alexa sat motionless, her expression unreadable. This wasn't the complete destruction she'd once imagined, watching him lose everything in spectacular fashion. This was something different, more powerful perhaps, forcing accountability, creating systemic change, proving that justice didn't require becoming the same monster she was fighting. "Effective immediately, I'm resigning as CEO of Hayes International Holdings," Carl continued. "I'm establishing the Maria Garcia Foundation with an initial endowment of $50 million to support single mothers pursuing business education. And I'm using whatever remains of my influence to advocate for workplace policies that don't force people to choose between family and career advancement." The press conference lasted 40 minutes. Journalists asked brutal questions Carl answered with unflinching honesty. When it ended, he'd lost the empire. He'd sacrificed everything to build, but gained something he hadn't possessed in 20 years. The possibility of becoming someone worthy of the air he breathed. 3 months later, Alexa stood on a different stage, receiving the Entrepreneur of the Year award. Garcia's strategic solutions had doubled in revenue, but more importantly, had shifted its mission toward mentoring young entrepreneurs from difficult backgrounds, creating pathways that didn't require privilege, connections, or abandoning your humanity to achieve success. "I learned business strategy from studying corporate titans," Alexa said in her acceptance speech, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "But I learned what success actually means from my mother, who sacrificed everything so I could stand here today." In the front row, Maria Garcia, her health restored by proper medical care, her face no longer grey with exhaustion, smiled with tears streaming down her cheeks. She wore a dress Alexa had bought her, lived in an apartment without holes in the ceiling, and finally had the space to breathe after 20 years of drowning. Carl M. Hayes taught me one final lesson, Alexa continued, her tone thoughtful rather than bitter. Success means nothing if it requires crushing the people you should have loved. Real power comes not from what you're willing to discard, but from what you're willing to build, protect, and fight for, even when it costs you everything. That evening, Alexa and Maria stood together on the balcony of their new apartment, watching the sun paint the city in shades of gold and amber. 20 years of struggle hadn't destroyed them. It had forged them into something stronger than privilege, more resilient than wealth, more powerful than the man who'd tried to erase them from his carefully curated success story. "Are you happy?" Maria asked quietly, her hand finding her daughter's. Alexa considered the question the empire she'd built, the justice she'd secured, the choice she'd made to create systemic change rather than simple revenge. "I'm proud," she said finally, "of us, of everything we survived, of what we built from the wreckage he left behind." Somewhere across the city, Carl M. Hayes sat in a smaller apartment, no longer a CEO, no longer powerful, beginning the long work of transformation that might never earn forgiveness, but was necessary nonetheless. He'd lost everything except the possibility of becoming someone better than the monster his ambition had created. The daughter he'd abandoned had given him that gift, not mercy, but accountability. Not forgiveness, but the space to prove that even the worst choices could become catalysts for change, if met with genuine consequences and honest reckoning. Justice, not revenge. Transformation, not destruction. And in the end, that victory belonged entirely to the women who'd survived him.